All right. Welcome everyone to the Mega Alumni Podcast. Mega is the graduate student organization of the Mechanical, Aerospace, and Nuclear Engineering Department at The Ohio State University. And as a part of this alumni podcast, we are hoping to connect our alumni with our current grad students and maybe even undergrad students to share some different career paths that people have taken once they have graduated from our department. Uh, and you, all the listeners and viewers, if there are new grad students that are watching this, feel free to follow us on all our different social media channels. They're posted in the YouTube description. We have an Instagram page, a LinkedIn page, and we'll also be posting podcast short clips on some of those platforms if you prefer to see shorter clips. Now, without further ado, yeah, a quick introduction. My name is Nehal. I'm a PhD candidate in the department. And without further ado, let me introduce our guest for today, Dr. Unnikrishnan, and he prefers just Unni. So thank you, Unni, for joining us for this episode. Uh, can you give us a quick background and introduction about yourself, and then we can go into all the different topics that we had discussed?
Yeah, so good morning, all. Thanks, Nehal, for organizing this. So it's my name is Uni. I graduated from Ohio State in 2017. I did my PhD and postdoc there, and it's a great privilege to come back and talk to the students in the department. It has been very significant formative years of my technical career. So I'll be more than happy to share my experience and thoughts about what happened there, as well as how things evolved once I graduated. So it's my pleasure to take part in this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, currently you are a professor uh, in a college that is a joint between two universities, which is slightly interesting. So that's Florida A&M University and Florida State University, correct?
Yeah. So after my postdoc at Ohio State, so I joined my this job faculty started my faculty career in 2020 Jan. So I took up a position with mechanical engineering in FAMU-FSU College of Engineering. So as you correctly pointed out, this is a very unique setup. It's actually the only college. It's actually the only engineering college in the nation that is jointly owned by two universities. So Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, FAMU, and Florida State University, FSU, has their combined College of Engineering, which we call as the FAMU-FSU College of Engineering, located in Tallahassee. It's a great collaborative environment, as you can. And when you think about it, you have two universities to take care of a college. So
Right.
that provides you a lot of resources in terms of collaborative opportunities, grants. You have an extremely diverse body of undergraduate and student, undergraduate and graduate student body. And so it's a union between one of the top HBCUs, which is FAMU, and a leading R1 institution, which is FSU. So that provides us a lot of opportunities to do highly impactful research in terms of engineering challenges that we really need to address in today's world. Yeah, it's a very unique and a very diverse network, diverse setup that we can work with, both in terms of opportunities as well as students.
Got it. Yeah, that's quite interesting. So I'm wondering, so in terms of the support that you get from the R1 university, that's I'm guessing more really helping for on the research side of things, and maybe the investment in terms of research labs and stuff like that, whereas the other college is giving you access to a whole other student pool
Yeah,
as well.
student pool, and they have their own sources of support for us.
Okay.
So we can tap into both universities. We
Okay.
can reach out to. So it's actually a joint appointment. So we can equally collaborate with faculty from both the universities and write joint grants and support students, cross support students between projects between the two universities. Yeah.
I see. I see that. Okay, that's interesting. And so when it comes to, since you're a professor, when it comes to teaching courses and classes, how does that work in this kind
Yeah,
of an
so
environment?
it's so the way it works is students enroll in their parent universities dependent on like
Mm-hmm.
whether you are a FAMU or an FSU admit. You spend your first years in those respective home universities, and then once you start in getting into the advanced years of your engineering degree, you will be transferred to the College of Engineering, where you will be taking classes as like a common batch. So irrespective whether you come from FAMU or FSU, your engineering classes are done together within the COE. COE, the College of Engineering, is a separate campus from FAMU and FSU. It's close to both universities, but it
Oh,
is a physically different campus. So once you graduate into your higher, advanced years, so you come to the COE and start taking classes as one single batch. So you are no longer segregated in terms of universities. You're just one single batch over here.
got it. Got it. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right.
We have both FAMU and FU students in our lectures, so that's how
Right.
it works. Yeah.
Right. 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 Okay. Okay. Yeah. So since we're talking about teaching, I was wondering if there is anything that you're teaching right now, anything that you have taught so far.
Yeah, so my background is primarily fluid mechanics or aerodynamics as it pertains to aerospace engineering. And my research is based on numerical methods and computational fluid dynamics. So I teach subjects that are more related to these areas. So specifically, I'm teaching graduate math this semester, which is a core course for all fresh admits. So anyone who is joining the MS or PhD program needs to get that course checked off, because it makes sure, because since we have a wide range of institutions from which students come into the program, we want to make sure that we have the grad students all on the same page,
Right.
irrespective of which lab they are going into for their research. So there are some fundamental math topic like calculus, ODEs, and series analysis, things like that, that needs to be learned, linear algebra, that needs to be learn irrespective of what exactly you are going to do in a grad study. So the math course we are offering is a core course that addresses these fundamental topics in math, so that all grad students are on the same page on these very basic concepts. And alternate semesters, I teach computational fluid dynamics for grad students, and a bit more fundamental course, which is numerical methods, that's tailored for undergrad. That makes the, or that builds the stepping stone into these advanced numerical and computational techniques that we use in engineering. Yeah. So I switch between these two alternate semesters, but the core course in math is offered every fall.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that takes me back to some of the earlier semesters of coursework that I was doing here. So yeah, that sounds very
Yeah,
familiar.
yeah, yeah.
Since I'm also
I
in
know
that
Professor
area.
Majumdar used to do a lot of this. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So yeah, so in terms of teaching, I'm wondering, did you have any prior experience before you started off in this role, or did you really figure out your teaching methodology and style as you started this professoriate role?
So like any grad student, I used to do TA both in
Okay.
my master's and PhD. So I did have some idea of what graduate teaching is like, but not so much of undergraduate experience. So that was really new. But even with that TA experience in graduate teaching, uh, doing a whole course by yourself is slightly different from stepping in to do a few lectures or doing TA duty alone. So I think every one of us who eventually take up this profession needs to figure it out on our own. Like it's more like how you adjust to the students and make sure you take all of the every single one in that batch along with you, right? Leaving nobody behind. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's up to the instructor to figure out a style that suits them. At the same time, it needs to be it needs to be made sure that people or students understand what you're basically telling them, and instilling that interest or that motivation to learn, especially mathematics and analytic subjects are it's very critical to make sure students are motivated to learn those, because in many scenarios, I think these core courses are the introduction, or that's the door basically through which our fresh students see graduate study. So you want to make a good impression on the students on what the whole thing is about. It's not like undergrad, you're coming into grad research, which is a bit more open-ended. You may not have closed form solutions to all your problems. So teaching is very important in that aspect as well. It sets the tone for the incoming batch of students. So that way I had to kind of learn a lot in terms of what it takes to keep their interest going and tie it back into some real life problems that you might end up doing in your respective lab. So that was a learning challenge. As far as undergraduate teaching is concerned, the main challenge was again to make sure people or students at senior or sophomore level do not have a fear of coding, because I teach numerical methods and it comes with a lot of coding challenges. So we have really good students, just that there is a perspective there existing in some sense, which gives a sense of insecurity or a false sense of fear that says that oh, coding is difficult, or solving things using complicated math is beyond me. I mean, that is not true, right? So the biggest challenge I had to face was to boil down these concepts into simple lectures and make sure that uh, reassure students that you can do this, right? So it's not
Right,
something that is impossible.
right,
And
right, right.
it's such a fundamental thing nowadays, because um, solving our current engineering challenges are so complex that you almost always take recourse to a computer program to solve something, right? So you need to have that basic exposure to utilizing computers to solving engineering problems very early on in your undergraduate training. And keeping that in mind, I had to kind of impress upon the students in some sense. This is
Absolutely.
important
Right.
and it's not something to fear. So yeah, teaching coding and advanced math is one of the challenges that I deal with.
Right. Yeah, and that brings up a follow-up question, something that I'm curious about. Since I know that in both of our labs here at OSU, we use some maybe legacy codes as well, some older compile languages, stuff that is maybe not. I think your lab also used to use Fortran here, right? Dr. Mazumdar
Yes.
also has some Fortran code. So I've often seen this hesitation with maybe compile languages that they can be a little harder to get into. So I was wondering if you have leaned into maybe student or encourage students to maybe use MATLAB or Python or something like that to ease their way into coding when you are doing your coursework right now. Or is yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with that, because when you start teaching coding and numerical methods and straight away throw Fortran or C, uh, students, if they are doing it for the first time, they can be overwhelmed, right? Because there's a lot of intricacies in that. So when we start out these undergraduate and graduate courses, even the CFD course for graduate students, I suggest that they use MATLAB to do that, because that gets them past their fear of coding, right? Because it's so
Correct.
user friendly. But if it is the coursework part we are looking at, that is sufficient. But as soon as we get into research, right? So once you choose your lab and get into that part of the serious grad work, then I strongly encourage at least those students coming to my group to start get comfortable with Fortran or C, because you cannot do advanced computing with ease using very high level programming. You need to be dealing with low level programming to understand what the basics of scientific computing, the basics of coding, basics of parallelization. Those things have to be explored with low level programming. And it's not necessary that you always use low level programming. At
Right.
some point in your career, you might eventually use some of these easier to or user friendly type R or Python or Julia, stuff like that. It's perfectly fine. What I meant to say was that you just cannot use that without being exposed to low level programming.
Right.
Once you're
Right.
running a coursework and you join a lab, that's the time when you are learning, right? You're in a lab, you are surrounded by a lot of students, seniors, and people who have done this before you. So that's the time where you can actually explore some of these more intricate programming practices and build your foundations. Once you're strong with it, then of course you can easily, if you can handle Fortran or C, you can easily do MATLAB and Python, right? That's what I tell students. So in coursework, we stick with MATLAB or Python if they want it.
Right.
But when it comes to grad research, I always suggest that you start it with a low level language.
100%. Yeah, that makes sense and is kind of mimicking my personal journey as well of maybe starting off with MATLAB and then slowly getting more
Yeah.
comfortable with Fortran, and then now I'm trying to use OpenFOAM for some of my research, so then understanding C++ as well. But so now, since we are getting into the territory of maybe research and graduate students, I was curious if you can go into some more details into what research your lab is doing there. I know you have a couple of points that you have on your webpage, but I would just, yeah, like you to maybe share whatever you wanted to talk about first, and then we can go in detail.
Yeah. So when we started out at our lab at FSU, we were looking at establishing like a center of excellence sort of a institution in aero propulsion. So FSU has a lot of legacy programs in experimental aerodynamics. Our lab was trying to kind of complement that on the computational side. So we started investing heavily in aero propulsion. So we have research that look into ramjet engines, how aerodynamics of ramjet engines work, what kind of operating conditions are favorable, what kind of scenarios make the engine lose compression efficiency, things like that.
Mm.
So intakes or ramjet compression systems is one of our core focus areas. The other area of research we pursue is hypersonics because there's an increase in interest in hypersonics both in civil and defense purposes or space applications. So we look at transition and turbulence in these extremely high speed flows, which require specialized tools to simulate and validate and accommodate all the physics that goes into hypersonic flows. So that's another focus areas. The other being more recent are unsteady aerodynamics in terms of what happens when you have high angle of attack lifting surfaces or high angle of attack nose cones. There's a lot of flow separation, unsteadiness, and multi-scale fluctuations in the fluid medium surrounding these high angle of attack lifting bodies, right? So we do a lot of collaborative work on understanding those large-scale vertical unsteadiness in these configurations. So these are some of the core areas we look at. And in all of these efforts, we do have very tight experimental collaborations from FSU as well as outside. So um, none of these problems are simple. So it would be too naive to just think that we can solve everything through computation. So we
Right.
need collaborative efforts that use experiments theory and high fidelity simulations to capture all the physics going into these physics these kind of flow fields. So that's something that we are actively pursuing. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. So I'm wondering if could you go into some details about your research work at OSU as a grad student and as a postdoc, as in how did that tie into the work that you're currently doing? Did it tie in very naturally or organically, or were there some pivots that you had to make? Uh,
So at Ohio State, I was working with Professor Gaitonde's group. He does a lot of high fidelity simulations for a lot of problems actually. So yes, so the mentoring I received in that group was instrumental in shaping my technical philosophy on like how to go about research in short. So I was working on jet noise characterization and reduction in my doctoral thesis. And in my postdoctoral work, I continued some part of that, but also started heavily looking into hypersonics and understanding transition in hypersonic flows. And that was really, at that time, the national interest was booming in high-speed hypersonics aerodynamics. So, uh, uh, and I think that the my experience in the lab really helped me naturally choose some of those focus areas for my future like positions. And I would say, like, to directly answer what you asked, yes, it was pretty natural and organic. And the topics that we work on here are natural extensions on what my training was on. So yes, that really tie in well with what I'm doing now. And it's not just the projects that I was working on that led me into this current portfolio. It's
Mm-hmm.
more of what kind of exposure I got in the lab as a whole. So there were people working on short boundary interactions. Then there were people working on ramjets, research on twin jets, research on data-driven analysis. A lot of these things that um, went on in the lab during that time really kind of expanded my horizon beyond my thesis. And that's something which I think is very, very important for any grad student to get into the lab culture. It's not that you will learn everything that everyone else is doing, because you don't get a PhD for breadth. You get a PhD for in-depth analysis of one problem. But that doesn't mean you should be insulated to things around you. So being in that lab culture, being around with your friends, because it's a pretty open environment where there is nobody to judge you. All of you are learning together, right? So it's a very conducive environment for discussions and mutual influence uh, that really help expand your knowledge base and your outlook to certain problems. So I think not just my research, my fellow students, my fellow lab mates and postdocs who were there at that time really helped me get a broad view of what problems are important for a fluid mechanist in aviation or aerospace engineering. So that really helped me pick and choose problems once I started off as a faculty myself. Yes.
Got it. Got it. And then I think the kind of follow-up thought that I had, which is also because I'm also doing numerical work and CFD. The other question that I kind of had, because you also highlighted this term, high fidelity
Yeah.
simulations.
Yeah.
Uh, and we also, when I'm meeting with my advisor, sometimes we have this discussion that, okay, what is the simulation going to give us? Why are we doing this? And so, like, what is the level of fidelity we need? What is the purpose of this? And based on that, I think sometimes the nature of the models that we're using, the so-called fidelity that we're using in the simulation keeps changing. I was wondering if you were saying that when you were doing grad research here, you're working on jet noise, right?
Yeah.
That was your in-depth topic. And so you maybe build up more uh tools or understanding on what high fidelity means for that kind of a specific output, or something. If you're seeking in that area, what would high fidelity mean? I'm wondering if the high fidelity models, or what you need to consider in your numerical simulation carefully, uh, also changes based on the application that you're working on, or or have you realized that it is more so to do on the post-processing side based on what you're looking for, and the simulation itself or the models itself may be using some threshold of uh, models is sufficient enough, and then based on how you post-process the data, look at it, and that is what gives you insights in the different applications, since now you're working on so many different kind of things, right? So yeah, curious how.
Yeah, so I mean, it's partly, or I would agree to one of that interpretations you had. It's subjective. High fidelity is subjective. So when we think about, at least in the world of numerics and computational modeling, we say that like all models are wrong, some are useful, right? So at the end of the day, it's a model. So the question is, how do you trust it, right? And it's also correct that you said it depends on the specific application. You cannot generalize a high fidelity because anything that is high, low, anything that has an adjective is relative, right? Relative to
Right.
what?
Right.
Right. So let's say that, like, let's look at the canonical example in aerospace engineering. Consider the flow around an airfoil, and decades before, people know how to evaluate the lifting capability of an airfoil. You have simple relations that provide you the lifting coefficient for an airfoil. Or when you had a bit more computational or linear algebra advancements in solving linear systems, you could easily evaluate the lift produced through by an airfoil through panel methods. That's one of the simplest methods, right? So we can assume panel method is one of our baseline fidelity. Okay, so that's one of the basic methods for calculating lift. But then as we develop more and more computational power, our solution algorithms became more complex. We were able to do linear Euler simulations, like inviscid simulations, right? So now we are bringing in the nonlinearity in the flow. We can bring in multidimensional effects, things like that, correct? But then again, when we had more computational power, we said, why not resolve the boundary layer? So now we bring in viscosity. So Euler simulation is a step above panel methods. And when you have viscosity included, we are bringing more physics into the flow, right? And then we say that we could model turbulence. So RANS comes up. And eventually we get unsteady RANS when there is significant unsteadiness in the flow. Or now when you have extremely high angles of attack, when flow doesn't behave in a manner that is consistent with the assumptions of turbulence on which RANS models are built, you eventually throw away all the reduced order or the reduced fidelity and say, I'm gonna just use brute force and use extremely well resolved DNS, right? So as you can see, over the years, we have graduated from panel methods to Euler to RANS to DNS. In between, we have detached eddy simulations and things like that. But you see, at each level, what we are trying to do is it's the same aerofoil, it's the same boundary condition. We are just trying to bring in more fluid physics into it, right? So for maybe a panel method, URANS is high fidelity, but for a DNS, URANS is low fidelity, right? So that's what I said, where the fidelity is highly relative to what is where you are standing, your reference, right? And
Right.
the other important thing is it's not just relative comparison between methods. It's comparison with your application. For example,
Right.
your application may just need a ballpark estimate of the lift, and it would be foolish to run a three-dimensional DNS just to get an estimate of what a low angle of attack lift coefficient is for an aerofoil. You can easily get it from Xfoil or panel methods, right?
Right.
So I think for every application, if you have your requirement setup, you will have to do a cost benefit analysis to see how much resources you need to invest in to get a reliable output, and how
Right.
much uncertainty or how much error bars are you willing to deal with. And that is what eventually decides you to pick the computational model, and that sets your fidelity. And the more resources you input, the lesser your error bar is, the higher the investment, the higher the fidelity. The fidelity brings in more and more first principles into the simulation, right?
Right.
So you're not relying on any assumptions or models. You are basically resolving the physics using the basic equations of motion without accumulating any error in that. I mean, in some sense, right? So that's what fidelity and high fidelity, low fidelity really means. Uh, the other thing is uh, you always have to have some bench. I mean, it helps to have a benchmark in terms of a field test or a experimental counterpart where you can probably compare your low fidelity and say that, yeah, it's pretty much seeing what the experiment sees. In that sense, we are high fidelity for our application, right?
Right.
So it's a very complex component of any engineering analysis, I would say, to decide what that the operating point is, like how much you have to invest and how much it gives back to you. So make that choice based on your specific application, and then you can call it the intermediate level fidelity or high fidelity or low fidelity simulation or estimates of performance for your application. That's how I see that classification. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. As somebody who's also working in the area and then always trying to navigate that, okay, what is the literature in this particular area referring to as, as a cheap way to maybe compute those things or a more accurate way, but with that cost that you need to pay in CPU time.
Yeah.
Uh, and so let's say now that you do have all of this data, you're using all these different models. I know you talk about a couple of different things on your website, and you just briefly mentioned as well the uh, a tool set of statistical, spectral tools, operator aware, and data-driven analysis techniques. So I was wondering if there is something you can talk about all of these different tools and maybe highlight as to why one specific tool is used in place of the other, and why not just have, this one amazing tool that does everything for you. Yeah.
So yeah, so I think the basic motivation there is, so for example, if you look at modern computing like paradigms like GPU computing, you can run like a 250 million grid simulation on a laptop nowadays, right? So if you have a laptop which has a graphics card, you can actually do 250 million point calculations easily. But it's good that you can simulate it. But the more important question is, so what? What will you do with that data? The bigger the data, the more challenging it is to make sense out of it, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just sufficient to do big calculations. It's equally important to come up with insightful techniques that can extract physics from it, from within it, right? So you need to have reliable methodologies that can go into your supercomputing or this all-encompassing ultimate simulation and actually extract the features that matter to you, right? And that's where the analysis techniques come into play, because without that, your simulation is just zeros and ones in some hard drive somewhere, right? So we use so again, if you get into the terminology, it's a big world in itself. Like there are multiple classifications possible for the same analysis technique. But in general, based on what you said, statistical tools or spectral tools look at extracting or defining data in easily recognizable manner. For example, it can tell you what frequencies are important in the system, or what length scales are important in the system, and is there any coupling going between different phenomena, or what are the spatial scales that are driving something that is of interest to you, right? So it basically goes into the data and boils it down into mathematical quantities that you can use to define the flow phenomena. So that it puts a number and a shape and a meaning to those zeros and ones inside the hard disk. So that's what it really tells you. And uh, in terms of operator aware, that means the analysis you are doing is basically dependent on the formulation. For example, that technique might need you to be aware of the Navier-Stokes operator in the scenario of fluid flows, right? So any technique that is relying on the fundamental governing equations to make sense of data is what we call as operator aware. Okay, so it needs to know
Got
what
it.
operator generated the data.
Got it. Got it.
But then there are techniques which are purely data driven, that is agnostic to the underlying equation. All it needs is data.
Right.
It extracts meaning from the data without knowing what equations generated those. And
Right.
then it is up to the user to interpret that output of that data-driven technique in the context of your governing equation to make a call on what this really means, right?
Right.
All our data-driven techniques or learning algorithms are essentially unaware of what actually drives the dynamical system, right? It purely learns the trends from the data generated. So that's the fundamental difference. It needed to know whether it came from a structural equation or your social media network data or your Navier-Stokes equation. It's data for it or a stock market data, right? So
Right.
it works on it to extract meaning and trends from within the data. And then it's your job to, as a user, it's your job to make sense of what it means in the context of the original system that produced that data.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, and so I'm thinking, as you were defining operator aware and data driven, I'm wondering, because now there's a lot of focus on the buzzwords machine learning and AI. So I was wondering if the just using the definitions you gave would just use, like, for let's say in the context of CFD, we have snapshots of data from a DNS or LES simulation, and we are using a neural network to, let's say, get some patterns out of that. So that would be data driven. But let's say if we use an approach like PINs, which is physics informed neural nets, would that be operator aware in some way? Is that what you're referring to, operator aware? Or
So So pins are essentially improving that data-driven methods
right,
by infusing some flow physics into it. Like you take
right,
an intermediate layer in your network and then modify the defining coefficients of that layer so that it represents the flow physics, for example. So the system, so that means the system is now tailored to your flow problem, right?
right.
So I would say that is some sort of a hybrid version where it's
Okay,
data driven, but it is an improved. It's not completely agnostic to what's going on.
right,
It's biased. It's a biased data driven technique that has
right,
biased in a good way, right? It's
right,
biased so as to be tailor made for your application. So that it's,
right.
I mean, again, it can vary depending on who talks about it, but
Mm-hmm.
the way I see it is it's still a data-driven technique, but it is tuned to your specific problem, right?
Got it.
For example, an operator-aware technique would be a linear stability operator, which works on
Mm,
the linearized equations to
mm.
extract low-rank models like stability modes or forcing response modes in the flow.
I
So
see.
those are the formulation the formulation is built around the governing equations. So
Got
that
it.
is an operator aware or operator driven method. On the other hand, if you look at techniques like POD or things
Mm-hmm.
like time stepper methods, they really don't want your Navier-Stokes equation, right?
Right,
They can be used. You can use data to extract a lot of important information
mm-hmm.
regarding the dominant scales of unsteadiness or the leading instabilities of the flow. So those are more like data driven or things that are not dependent on the operator.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that really, I think, clarifies what data driven versus operator aware could really mean. Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And since you talked about so many different tools, I'm wondering if there is anything in particular for young researchers, experimentalists, and people doing numerical simulations, everybody at OSU, all my peers right now, if there's any particular set of tools or maybe one tool that you would say has been becoming very important in the recent times that everyone should learn
So
to maybe, yeah,
I don't know. Like, I mean, again, it ties back into your previous question. Is there one tool, one cool tool that can
right.
do it all? I don't think so. At least I'm not aware of something. And that's the beauty of research. If such a tool existed, right? Why do we need PhDs? We
That's
just
true.
sell. I mean, everyone can sell that tool, and all
Yes.
our problems will be solved, right? So I don't think that exists because we still have a lot of PhDs going around, right?
Right.
Uh, but the idea is to embrace the fact that, and in fact, it's important to understand the fact that there is no like a one pill solution to
Hmm.
chaotic dynamical systems. That's something that all the advanced algorithms are struggling with, right? Dynamical systems that entertain chaos eventually are very difficult to, you cannot homogenize those.
Right.
Each has its own unique trend. So it applies to the same thing applies to the tools that needs to be utilized for these systems, right? So you need to be, before you select a tool as a student, like since you brought this in the context of grad studies, I would say the first, rather than look for a tool to solve the problem, I think what we ought to do is embrace the problem first, like understand the problem. So what is this system? What am I looking at? Is it like is this a fluid system? Is it a structural system, or is it a material science related stuff? But the idea is to embrace the physics of the problem and fully kind of assimilate the complexity of it, right? So once you understand the physics, then you could make logical arguments on what kind of techniques could potentially solve it for you or extract the meaning from. So the tools come as a solution to the problems, because if you don't understand the problem, you'll be just blind guessing. Let me use FFT, or let me use GMD. Like, what does that even mean if you don't know what the problem is, right? So I would say understand the problem first, discuss it with your advisor, what the physical significance of this problem is, and why would you choose a tool to solve it? What is the strength and weakness of the respective tools, and why do you think that this tool would be a good match for this problem? Right? So it's extremely important to understand the problem first, convince yourself the physics of it, and then go looking for tools that could probably address that physics. Okay. An example would be like in jet noise. When we were studying jet noise, of FFTs and frequency spectra, it's a very common way to look at noise, because it tells us the frequency, amplitude of how much noise is generated from a source, right? But uh, we were looking at a very specific characteristic of net jet noise that makes it extremely loud, and that was intermittency. Intermittency means a jet exhaust doesn't create sound continuously. It creates it in bursts of activity. So our regular tools like Fourier analysis cannot actually predict those intermittent events. So we had to tailor a lot of our analysis techniques to look at phenomena that are localized in space and time, that travel as, say, wave packets or intermittent events. So if you are just trying tools blindly, we would have never gotten the insights we did during that time. So I think it is important to appreciate the complexity of the problem and then evaluate the techniques for its merits and limitations. I would say be more aware of its limitations, because you would definitely want to know where it fails. And then choose it. So that's the philosophy that I would encourage my students to follow. And regarding what the students would learn, I would say again, I wouldn't suggest I wouldn't put any labels on what you have to learn in terms of tools, but I can definitely tell you what will help you learn these tools in the future. As you do your, or as you go through your formative years in grad studies, you need to be refreshing concepts of linear algebra, differential equations, calculus, and statistics. So if you do math courses or ME related courses that addresses these topics, numerical methods, you will have the solid foundation to pursue these tools, because all these tools under the hood use some of these basic math, right? So it's important that you refresh these concepts. That is what I would be looking at. And if you kind of refresh some of these basic concepts in math, choosing the tool won't be a difficult task. But because if you don't know series analysis, orthogonal functions, you would have no idea to differentiate what a Fourier analysis is versus a wavelet analysis, right? Or if you don't know things about linear algebra, it's very difficult to look to interpret what POD produces versus what DMD produces, or what is an eigenmode of base flow or a basic state. So it's important that you learn the math concept first before you jump into labeled fancy package tools, because all of those under the hood uses these concepts. So I think if you learn the basics, the rest is the basics plus your physical appreciation of your research problem will naturally lead you to the tool that helps you solve it.
That 100% makes sense. And I think, at least over the years, that's how I've come around to think about it as well. But you kind of laying out everything so clearly, I'm sure is going to be very beneficial for all the grad students who are just starting off and who keep thinking about why do we have a math requirement, uh, and which math course to take. So there you go. Like a lot of these tools, the underlying concepts are all maths. And I think you highlighted a very great, a good thing, that think about the problem that you're solving, and that way you kind of stay connected to your research goals in some way as well. And so when you're learning the math tools, you can think about, okay, what this math concept is going to help me figure out in some solution, in some data set. And that way, hopefully, you can stay more engaged with the math material as well, because sometimes in the math course, maybe it doesn't seem, the dots are not connected right away, but at least if you start thinking about it beforehand, it'll settle in well in your head, which definitely settles in regardless once you are in the later phase of your PhD. But the sooner you can get that done, the sooner you can figure out what all exists out there and what all you can use. So
Yeah, yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
Because math itself can be abstract to, at least for me, from an engineering
Oh,
perspective.
yeah,
Math itself is abstract, but the physical appreciation of the problem helps us connect with the math concepts, and then that leads us to a potential tool. That's how I
100%.
see it. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
100%.
yeah.
I 100% agree. I know that we are kind of running out of time, so maybe we'll do some quick questions. The one quick question that I had, which I don't know if this is something your research group is doing, but uh, as you mentioned that even GPUs that we have in our laptops have now become so powerful for doing so many computations for large grid sets. Is your lab actively working on codes that are utilizing GPUs? Because I know a lot of the historical scientific computing code is CPU focused, but I know that there has been a transition that has been happening in the past, I think 5 to 6 years, where people are trying to come up with more GPU based codes. I was wondering if that is some work that your group is also doing.
So as a relatively younger research group, we do not rely on legacy codes. We develop solvers on the fly.
Okay.
And in that sense, we are more versatile in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
we may not have tools as powerful as legacy codes, but we do have tools that are specialized to do the problems that we solve for. Like it's more tailor made for our problems,
Right.
and we don't have one unique code the lab uses to solve all the problems. They are tailored for research. Yeah, so in that context, the whole point there is we can actually become a bit more flexible depending on what the state of the art is in terms of
Hmm.
computing. Right now, our the major research codes we use are still CPU, but we do have some effort in house to convert smaller codes as a learning experience for students on
Right.
GPUs. The only trick there is to make sure we have the correct hardware. Students are
Right.
aware of what hardware needs to be installed and what hardware needs to be purchased in some sense
Mm-hmm.
to develop these codes. They need to have training practice before they take a whole Navier-Stokes system and then develop a GPU code around it. So we are starting with GPU parallelization of partial differential equations, multidimensional physical heat conduction, things like that, so that students get some hands-on experience on GPU or CUDA coding. And eventually, our hope is we will have enough hardware to kind of uh, run a full-blown Navier-Stokes solver on it. But that's in the sometime in the future. But we are definitely looking in that direction. Yes.
Got it. Got it. That sounds very interesting. Uh, yeah. So as we're getting closer, maybe I should wrap up to the with the last 2 points. Yeah. So congratulations on being on the ASME 2024 watch list. I was reading that magazine and I saw your name and I saw that you were
Oh, thank you.
from our department. And I even remember catching one of your seminars. It was interesting read. And they also mentioned that you won the Young Investor Program Award from the Office of Naval Research.
Thank
Congratulations
you.
on that,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that this is just the beginning of a series of accolades that are coming your way. But
No, I think
uh,
it's a reflection, right? So, I mean, essentially, it reflects the research we do, and I think all I have to do is thank my students and postdocs to maintaining that high levels of standards they do in research and publications. And they are the ones who are doing the work. And of course, mentors are very critical. Getting the right mentors that show you the right direction, that provide you the right collaborators, it all just works together, right? So it's the whole research enterprise that's helping you succeed. So I think it's more than it looks like. It is a very highly collaborative or team
Hmm.
effort. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, as all our listeners and viewers also now can see that Uni has come a long way from doing work at OSU and is making great progress in so many areas now. Uh, is there any advice that you would like to share to our current grad students, like general advice? And I usually split this up into three parts so that maybe it's a little more tailored to a grad student in a particular phase. So either somebody who's just starting off grad school, somebody who's somewhere in the middle, and someone who is ready to graduate very soon. Uh,
Sure. So I will start from the first level. So I assume that it is equally applicable to the higher levels, right? So when
yeah.
you first
Okay.
start out, uh, develop a lab culture, be around the lab, because that is the most influential factor in your journey. This 3 to 5 years we are spending in grad, depending on how you look at it. Get a very trustworthy professional lab collaborative network, so that you get to learn from each other. It needn't be reading a book. You can be in the lab and just overhear people talking about their technical projects. So
Right.
that be in the lab environment, get that lab culture in you right away in the first year. People who are in the mid journey, I would say be brave, in the sense that you start out with some idea, but you will hit a roadblock, right? Research never goes unidirectionally. You crisscross all the
Right.
time, right?
Right.
So I would say be brave when approaching the problem in different manners. Look at concepts that you might not be fully aware of, and uh, develop a very healthy and open relationship with your advisor, because uh, keeping them always on the same page where you are is very important, because nobody likes surprises, especially advisors, right?
Hmm.
So nasty surprises. So I would say that always have very clear view of what their expectations are, what your expectations are, how things are panning out for from both sides. And the mid journey is where you start focusing on publication. So be brave, be professional with your advisor, start looking into your potential publications. And people who are wrapping up, I would say, never be complacent. There is no point in your career where you can be comfortable with what you know. A bit of insecurity, in a good sense, is always good. That keeps you on your toes, open to learning, and that keeps you, that humility is what helps us constantly learn.
Hmm.
So I think, uh, n- in short sentence, don't be too comfortable what you have achieved or what you already know. Be always open. And I would say that depending on what kind of preferences you would like in your career, like start looking for opportunities in industry, academia, or government by your third year, fourth year, and see what, you cannot kind of bypass the requirements of your project or your coursework, but kind of tailor your electives or your your soft skills or your specialized skills in a manner that is consistent with your career track, without diluting your core research.
Right.
It's basically explore things on your own time, which can help you professionally build your network, or said there might be some hot skills that are really up for grabs in the market. So figure out those, but do not forget that whatever skills industry or your job market wants, it's a cycle. They
Right.
they come and go, but your
Right.
fundamentals are always there to stay. So as I said earlier, build your fundamentals on rock solid math and science and physics, and then from there do your research, reach out to those